It is April 10th, 8 p.m. Hello, my name is Daisuke Tsuda. I am a journalist. This is a co-organized event with Goethe-Institut. We are broadcasting this program with their support. This is Studio 2020X, the name of the program. This is part 2 of this broadcast. In our first edition, we talked about cultural policy in times of crisis. We talked to the Senator for Culture in Europe of Berlin, as well as lawyer Kensaku Fukui, as well as playwright Oriza Hirata, as well as House of Representatives member Manabu Terata. We talked about what kind of cultural policy, what kind of support aid is necessary in this corona outbreak. The second part 2 of this broadcast, the title is Virus Tracking, Privacy Hacking Between Surveillance Society and Freedom. So big data now is a widely used term. So we use big data in our smartphones. In many other ways, we collect that information, and that is being widely used in society. In the coronavirus outbreak, control measures are using GPS data to prevent clusters. They're using information technology, and that is proving to be very effective. At the same time, being able to use GPS data has there's lots of people that are wary of this because it could impede on personal privacy. So where do we draw a line in terms of utilizing this kind of technology? Is it do we veer toward freedom or surveillance? So in this sense, the outbreak of this coronavirus, the influence it has on society as it becomes prolonged, we need to think about how we think about technology that tracks personal information and its relation to curbing the corona outbreak, the merits that are there, as well as its dangers. So if we could talk about that in this broadcast. Our guests, we have 3 panelists today. We have Stephanie Hankey, Executive Director of Technical Tech. We have lawyer Michiko Kameishi, as well as Takashi Okumura, a professor and director of Kitami Institute of Technology, as well as the Health Administration Center of the university. 3 of you, thank you for participating. We're all connected through Zoom. So, the theme of this discussion is a very heavy theme, and there's lots to talk about. First of all, I would like the panelists to talk about their background and to talk about the issues that they are concerned with. So first, I'd like Mr. Okumura to begin. If you could do a self-introduction and talk about infectious disease prevention as well and personal information. So if the 3 of you could talk about that, maybe you can start with Mr. Okumura. If you could start, please. Hello. My name is Okumura. I'm from the Kitami Institute of Technology. My specialty is public health. I'm a doctor. And I'm also a researcher of computer technology. I do basic research. So the reason I've been called to this discussion is to talk about public health administration in Japan, namely tracing patients using GPS data through mobile phones. So I've been doing that for about 10 years. In terms I'm very specialized in this field. I think our group was the first to look into this area So I would like to provide information how this technology could be useful in tracking infected patients. Mr. Okumura, you are so fitting as a specialist for this particular discussion. So controlling infectious diseases and its relation to personal information, so linking those two to control infections, I think that's very rare that people that kind of specialize in this area. Am I right? To be exact, in this globally researching, it's a very limited field on a global scale as well, using GPS data, individual location data to prevent infectious diseases. In 2015, South Korea faced a MARS outbreak. I don't know how many people remember this, but in 2015, there's about 188 infectants, and about 30-some people died. So and what was used during that time was that technology. There's one article about it, but there's no other cases after that. So there are very few researchers in this field. Sorry, I interjected. And so there are cases in South Korea. So it was GPS data was traced to it was used to trace infected patients. So what I was thinking in the context of Japan was that the situation is different here from South Korea. So in terms of private information, people that specialize in public health, we try to take into consideration the privacy of personal information as much as possible. That is our position. So when thinking of what is the goal, what is the aim for using this information, this is a little bit off topic from the pandemic, but measles, if in the case of measles, how we have tackled this in the field of public health is that we cannot disclose all the information of patients. So usage of transportation or using particular facilities, we would disclose part of that information. But citizens are not interested in that kind of information. And of course, the authorities can't share detailed information. But if it's kind of a general information, citizens are not interested. So how do we solve this problem? And so we used a little bit of the GPS the location data of mobile phones. By utilizing this, we're able to protect personal information, protect privacy, and at the same time control infectious diseases. That is our stance on this. So if I can show you this document. So our starting point. So when an infectious disease there's an outbreak. So this is looking at the relationship between personal information and preventing infectious diseases. So there's different levels. So for the coronavirus, there's lots of technologies that utilize location data. So this is kind of a general spreadsheet of this. I'm just going to touch on just the essential parts. So this is divided into two parts. The top part is so how authorities collect data, the method of collecting data, how they collect location data. So for example, GPS data. So Michiko will talk about that later probably. So collecting GPS data is one of them. So that's this area here. So the thing is, GPS gives us very detailed information, which makes it very accurate. But at the same time, there's also other ways other data that does not impede on personal privacy. At the same time, we look at means of disclosing data. So Malaysia and South Korea, so they disclose detailed location data of patients. So there's that risk of privacy breach. It's high. There's also ways to disclose a more general data. So that's a low risk of privacy violation. So this is the way I've organized this diagram. So when we talk about different technologies, we can look at. I think it might get a little bit complicated. So maybe we can look at this to go back to this diagram when we're a little bit confused. So I will speak for the public health field. So for those of us involved in the public health, working in administrations, so our top priority is the privacy of individual citizens. So let's say there's a patient. If we collect detailed data and we disclose that, if it's someone that has their own business or someone that runs an accommodation, it takes away their foundation for their livelihood. So our stance is to disclose as little information as possible. So we don't give the actual age of a particular information. We give kind of the generation, like they're in their 20s or 30s. So for this corona outbreak, the public health department, that was an area that we could not really become involved in up until this corona outbreak. Thank you very much for sharing. I think the last part that you shared was very important. One question that I have for you is, in 2017, the discussion that you had in 2017 regarding privacy, so the method, the granularity that you decided to gather information, disclose information, private information, and now that we have this corona outbreak, now that it's become a pandemic, are you now changing your stance, thinking that you need more detailed information? Is there a discussion being had around this? Currently, so the corona outbreak is influencing the lives of Japanese citizens. And so there is technology that we could use, but there's a question of how far can we go with it. And in order to do that, how can the state become involved in private information? We need to have that discussion. We're trying to have that conversation. Thank you very much. Going on, I would like Michiko Kameishi to talk about the GPS investigation violation case.
So she worked on this case where the suspect of a theft was actually traced with the GPS without any consent by the police. And so she was the head of the defense counsel, and actually they won. And I think there are many ways of discussing about these issues around GPS, so I hope she can start the discussion and introduce. My name is Michiko Kameishi. I'm a lawyer from Osaka. As Tsuda-san just introduced me, there was a theft case in Osaka, and one of the suspect was traced by the police with the GPS that was attached to his cars and his motorbikes without his consent. So I worked on this case, and the discussion of whether if it was illegal or not. And this decision was not made until when the case was brought all the way up to the Supreme Court, and finally at the trial there, it was ruled that it was illegal. But this GPS location data has been used for a long time by the police authority to do investigation, criminal investigation. So I would like to go over the history of this first. So I have some documents. Oops. So I'll talk along this diagram. In 2006, National Police Agency gave this notification to all the police across Japan about the usage of GPS data for criminal investigation. So putting the GPS on the cars and motorbikes to get the data on the location. So they gave the notification, the guidelines about the usage of this data for investigation. And on this guideline, it said that it can be done without any warrant. So it can be warrantless investigation. So that was the premise of this guideline. And also, it said that they have to thoroughly be secret about the usage of GPS. So they had to keep the confidentiality as much as possible, as completely as possible. In 2011, then the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications also had a guideline for the telecommunications carriers, saying that if the investigators have to get the warrant in order to use the data, the GPS data from the telecommunications carrier, and also another condition was that the telecommunications courier had to notify the subject that this data would be used. For the investigation. So they were not allowed to release this data without these warrants and also the notification. So the subject, but if the subject knows that they are being followed or their data of their location are being used for investigation, so in order for the investigations to go well, they have to they didn't want the subject to know. So they didn't necessarily follow this guideline that was sent to the telecommunications courier by the Ministry of International Affairs. And then in 2012, there was a case that was tried in the District Court of Fukuoka that that made it clear to the society that the police agency is actually using the police authority is actually using GPS to use using GPS for the investigation without any warrant, and it was claimed that was illegal especially because the location data is used is accumulated continually and also comprehensively. So that actually intervenes a lot into the various areas of personal information, and so the claim was that it must be illegal. It was actually violating people's privacy, but the court ruling actually didn't go step into say that it was actually illegal. In 2015, the Osaka District Court in Osaka actually ruled that it is illegal to use GPS investigation, to do investigation with GPS without warrant. And but at the same time, by the notification from that was announced, the guidelines gave by the Ministry of Internal Affairs for the telecommunications career was that if the investigation agency needed information on the GPS, that they only needed to get the warrant and they didn't have to notify the subject. So okay. But in 2017, at the Grand Bench of the Supreme Court, it was ruled finally that the warrantless GPS investigation was illegal. But what was important is then the question of what warrant was necessary for this GPS investigation, because in the current constitution, it doesn't necessarily cover the arena that can involve GPS usage. If a police were to arrest a suspect, they would, for example, notify the suspect that they're going to arrest, or if they're going to search somewhere, they would show the warrant. But with the GPS investigation, we cannot necessarily tell the suspect that they are going to do it beforehand, because then it would not be effective. So the current law doesn't necessarily cover the issues around GPS investigation using GPS. So the court ruling basically was that the best way is to actually enact a new legislature that deals with the GPS, the investigation using GPS. So taking this ruling, the National Police Agency gave a notification to all the police that they should actually refrain from using the GPS for investigation. And then the guideline by the Ministry of Internal Affairs was renewed, so that they could the police agencies can use. So they changed their guidelines so that the police authority can use the GPS data, can get the GPS data from the telecommunications courier with the pre-existing warrants. So it was in the Supreme Court ruling, it said that it strongly claimed that the new legislation has to be enacted to respond to the issues, especially in regards to conspiracy crime. But right now it's really easy for the police authority to do GPS investigation with the current warrant, current kinds of warrants. So the new legislation hasn't been enacted because it's still somehow the police agency can get away with working with the current warrants that are available in the Constitution. So if the location information doesn't necessarily identify personal information or personal behavior, But but the data, when the data actually allows people to understand the behavior of the suspect rather continually and also comprehensively, so this actually can give the possibility for the authority to have this excessive understanding of a suspect's behavior that would actually violate personal information. So we have to come up with a rules for using these GPS data. But at the current situation is that we have not been able to realize this. And the information, GPS information that is available from our mobile phones and so on, can be used by the police agency at the moment, the police authority at the moment. And also the attitude of using these personal data by the police authority is also very questionable in the way that, for example, they kept it very secret for a very long time from us that they were actually using this information, and also that even though the Supreme Court have ruled that it was illegal and that we have to come up with new rules for using these new kinds of data from GPS, the National Police Agency still continues to somehow try to get away with continuing to use this data without any revision of their attitude, their revisions of their rules with the current system. So I would like. So but we have to be very careful to see what's actually being done by these, especially with the situations changing a lot. What we do with this information, and we have to really. It has to be clear to us. We have to become more transparent, and we have to more discussion about this.
The last slide is very interesting in that we can utilize data consistently and exhaustively to prevent clusters, and in that sense it is very effective. But in terms of investigation, in 2017, we needed some kind of legislative measure to deal with this kind of GPS use. Yeah, we could touch on that in our discussion together in the second half of this broadcast. So we'd like to move on to Stephanie. She's the head of the NGO Technical Tech. We'll ask her what she does for technical tech, and also what issues she is interested in relation to the outbreak of the novel coronavirus, tracking personal information, how she feels about that, and also having heard the introductions from the other two panelists, what she thinks, her impressions of that too, if we could hear that. Over to you, Stephanie.
Hi. Yes, I'm a technology designer and researcher, and I'm the executive director of an organization that was founded in 2003. So we've been working on questions of technology and society for quite some time. We mainly engage in public education and thinking of ways to help public take part in these kinds of debates, to understand what people feel about these issues, and to help them figure out what they can do about it also.
Stephanie, can you stop there for a minute?
こんにちは、stephanieと申します。私はプラクティカルテックという団体で活動しているんですけれども、私自身テクノロジスト、そしてデザイナー、アクティビストとして活動しておりまして、このタクティカルテックという団体は2003年から 通じて行っているのはさまざまなリサーチですとか調査を通じて、特にその公共の、公共に語りかけていくこと、そして教育を行っていくこと、そして皆さんと共に議論を行っていくことというのを目的に活動しております。
Over to you, Stephanie.
So my position and the comments I can make, which I hope are helpful, are more from an international perspective. We work all over the world looking at these questions around the impact of technology on society, but also more specifically on privacy and data. And we have a couple of projects where we engage through different kinds of mechanisms. We engage people in discussions and debate. And so I can bring some of the conversations we've heard over the last few years in discussing this with hundreds of thousands of people, hopefully to this discussion today.
Consecutive translation is taking place. Over to you, Stephanie.
So I think the way we think about this is it's a very interesting historical moment. It's the first time that we've seen a kind of massive multi-layered infrastructure we already have in terms of the technology we have now, not just mobile phones, but also social media, CCTV cameras, data trails from credit cards, all kinds of different data. And it's the first time we're trying to use it, this kind of technology on a planetary scale for this kind of tracking. So we're talking about Japan now, of course, but this is also happening in almost every other country right now that has sophisticated infrastructure.
Consecutive translation taking place. Over to you, Stephanie.
I think one of the things that is interesting about this dilemma is that it's not, we talk about technology and we will talk about technology now, but actually from our point of view, the biggest dilemmas are rather cultural, social and political. The questions are around, what is the individual and the individual's need compared to the public good? What kind of trust do we have in the state and other entities like insurance companies? It's not only about the state, but also, it's not just about technology and health, but it's about societal values that we have. What is the right thing to do and what are the trade-offs that we're willing to make as societies?
Consecutive translation taking place.
健康を管理するようなところが、どういうふうにその公共の財産というものを捉えていくのかですとか、そういったテクノロジーと健康の問題だけでなく、社会的な価値観について私たちもう一度見直していかなければならない時にあると思います。
Over to you.
So these are quite philosophical questions, but there's also, just to bring to the discussion, because we talk mostly right now about the needs of the health sector and research, science research, and also, for example, the police. But I think we shouldn't overlook that in most cases, including in Japan, but in most countries, this is very dependent on the commercial sector, that the technologies that are used are already existing because of all the apps and social media and platforms and mobile phone providers that we use. And so this can be kind of switched on overnight, but it does mean that it brings a lot of dilemmas very quickly, because this is not how and why these technologies were developed. And so it brings a lot of problems when we use large-scale commercial technology to try to get on top of these kinds of issues.
Consecutive translation taking place. Over to you.
So I just, hopefully with this consecutive translation it will work, but I just want to talk about two main things. One is just talking about the ways we can understand the technologies, because there's so many and it's so complicated from an international perspective. So I just briefly introduce one way of thinking about that. And the second is just briefly introduce some regional differences in how this problem is being approached.
Consecutive translation taking place. Over to you.
So there we see 4 different types of technologies being used for different reasons. So sorry, maybe I said that again. We see 4 reasons for using technology, although the technologies are different. And I'll just briefly say what those 4 are. And it can help to separate them, because otherwise the conversation is very difficult to progress with. So one of the technology sets is around enforcement. So how do you get people to stay at home? How do you know if they've broken the rules? And that kind of thing. The second thing is around modeling. How do you, at a grand scale, or it could be a city scale, could be a country scale, could even be a regional scale. How do you model and understand the flow of infection and also the flow of people, and changes in their behavior? And then the third is around contact tracing, which we've already talked about a little bit, but there are many different ways of doing that through different technologies as well. And then the last one we only see the beginning of now, but it's starting to happen as well, which is documentation. So the idea of immunity passports, or ways that people can start to move around again as society comes back to normal. How could technology help identify who has and hasn't had coronavirus?
Consecutive translation taking place. Over to you.
So in each of those, there could be technologies like GPS and others, but there's also, we see use of other technologies like facial recognition technology, or ways in which not just mobile phones are used, but other kinds of information. So for example, cross-checking information, and that's when I think we face new dilemmas we haven't faced before, where, for example, public information may be mixed with private information. So for example, in Taiwan, there was a conversation around the question of pharmacies and hospitals being able to not only access health data about an individual, but also maybe travel data, for example, which might be from a commercial sector. So for us, I think it's interesting because it's not just one technology, it's many, and it's also about interrelationship between those technologies.
Consecutive translation taking place. Over to you.
So the last point I want to make, so as not to take too much time, and the rest we can maybe do in discussion, is about these regional differences. And I think our position is that these regional differences are already there. And what you're seeing now is them really coming to the surface. So you see a very different approach, for example, in Asia, specifically, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and to some extent, although it's different, China, in terms of, in general, how the public is engaged in and what the public sentiment is around connecting information systems and how that can work in society.
Consecutive translation taking place. Over to you.
In the US, we've seen in general that the laws are more heavily dependent on commercial technology and thinking about users and consumers rather than citizens. And on top of that, the US has a double responsibility because it's not just national technology they have to think about, but their technology is used in most of the world when you think about Facebook and WhatsApp and other technology companies having over 2 billion users, or Android having, I think, 3 billion users or so. The US has those companies in their country, and those companies are exporting their technologies across the world.
Consecutive translation taking place. Consecutive translation taking place. Over to you.
And lastly, from a European perspective, which is where I'm from, I live in Berlin, but I'm English. But from a European perspective, what we see is a lot of struggle around the question of, is there such a thing as democratic surveillance? Is there a way to track, on an individual level and a community level, and even a interregional level across borders, and control the disease through using technology, but to do it in a democratic way that gives governments or national health services extraordinary powers temporarily. And the question is this possible? And that's what I think a lot of European countries right now are struggling with.
Consecutive translation taking place. Over to you.
So yeah, maybe we can explore the rest in discussion.
Consecutive translation taking place. Stephanie, thank you very much. So we'd like to take a break and prepare for the discussion. We'll take a 5-minute break, and we will move on to the discussions. The 3 panelists, if you could just wait for us for 5 minutes, we'll take a 5-minute break. Thank you.
Okay, so we're starting the second section to have the engage in a discussion with the three panelists. This is Studio 2020X, co-hosted by Goethe-Institut Tokyo, discussing about the response to the novel coronavirus and virus tracking and issues around privacy. As the presentations, we just had presentations by three panelists. I think the issues for the discussions are rather clear. So this trying to control the infectious disease with the digital technology, I think it's being very active everywhere. So I would like to share some examples that I have put together. This is something that everyone's discussing right now. It's something that Google started. They're calling this community building to respond to the new coronavirus. For each country, the Google puts together the data of how people are moving. And how they're doing it is many people across the world using smartphones, handphones, and using these Google applications, especially of their map functions of the Google. So Google has this data of these people, these users who are using the map, and they have they can track the locations of these users. So this big data of the tracked locations, the Google is releasing for different countries. To see how, especially because many different countries have different situations, some areas have lockdowns and so on. So they're trying to use this big data to show how people are moving in different situations, in different with the different conditions with the lockdown and so on. This is the situation with Japan. So after this statement about the emergency state, it's 25% down in terms of people's movement, which is not nothing. It's actually quite, I think, something. It's being reduced, so there are many people who are staying home. And the percentage of the people who are staying home, we have 8% more of them in Japan. So actually, you can download this information for all the areas, all different cities or countries. So this is something that only Google, in a way, can do because of the data they have. So it's a modeling of where people are, how people are moving. Are they moving away? Are they coming somewhere? So it shows how a company, actually corporation, has such a grasp of the data. This is another platform. It's Yahoo, which is a Japanese company. This was released once. And then, so actually it's a map of how congested some areas of a city is. They had released it once and they closed it. They had terminated the service, but they restarted this service, which is done by using the data of the people who the users and how they're moving. So to see where it's congested and not. So it was re-released with this corona outbreak. This is the map of Tokyo, and where it's highlighted is where it's more congested and perhaps a higher possibility for getting infected. So when people have to really leave the house to get something done, they can perhaps try avoiding these areas of more congestion, more crowded. So Tokyo, around Tokyo Station, Shinjuku, it seems that Shibuya actually has less people than usual, especially after the emergency announcement.
Declaration of the state of
The
emergency.
declaration of the state emergency. This was something that Stephanie mentioned. Using technology in Asia, especially a more successful case is in South Korea. It's a very interesting case. This is actually an excerpt from a news broadcasting on April 8th in Japan. In South Korea, they're using three kinds of technologies. So one is this CCTV, and also GPS location data from different mobile phones. And the third is the credit card records. So where people use the card at what shops and so on. So they combine these three kinds of data to actually grasp the information of movement of any person 10 minutes and so before and after the being infected by the virus, and they can get this information in 10 minutes, and they're using this information to see where these infected people might have contacted other people, and then they release this information to all the people who might have come close to these people who are infected through mobile phone, so that all the people, all the citizens basically have the information about where the infected people are right away. So when you use this data this much, it can be actually effective in preventing the outbreak of the virus. But to have so much of the personal information to be taken by the authority is also a big concern. So this news broadcasting actually interviewed some people who lived in Seoul. Many of them mentioned that they are concerned about violation of privacy information. But in this time, I think it's really good for the public to know where people are moving, and especially the infected people. In Korean, actually, it's Google translated from the website in Korea. So this is the information that's actually sent to the citizens by the state. Of so this infected person went to this shop at this time, and then took this train to go to this place, and so on. I think if you use the Google, there's a timeline function. So this data that you can see with the timeline function is released to all citizens in Seoul. So this is, for example, about one patient. As you can see, it's a very detailed information. It doesn't release the personal name, but rather a very detailed information about where she or he has been. So based on this information released by the state, there are also websites using these data from the government. Corona Map, that site, for example, So you can see right away on the map where the infection happened. And then you can see the number. When you see the number and the number is big, that means that there are this many. So it's like a cluster happening there with this many people infected. So if you're moving from one place to another and you see on this map, you see the cluster happening there, then you rather avoid that location. So these are some of the examples that I have chosen to share with you. But Stephanie, what do you think about these different cases that I just shared?
They're very interesting, and I think they're really important because, for one quick reason, is that it's a very teachable moment for ordinary people to understand the technology that's been there all along. I think if you've just taken a moment to look at your own, for example, Google timeline, you'll find it quite surprising to see what level of detail it has. If you're not using Google, there's probably an equivalent like on your iPhone. And just having a look at that for yourself is really interesting learning that then you understand this is how the technology works. So that's an individual level, but from a societal level, and there are so many questions about what we're giving up when we give up this kind of information, but also about the efficacy of those techniques. So, for example, what we know now is that there are many people who have no symptoms ever. So these kinds of technologies, for example, where you choose to give up the information if you know that that you're infected, won't work with people without symptoms, which we know there are many, many of them. So they're never going to solve the problem, but they can make it less bad, I would say. They can reduce the amount of infections.
Mr. Okumura, these initiatives, hearing Stephanie's concerns, what are your impressions? You're on mute, I believe. Thank you. South Korea. So they've been very public, disclosing a lot of private information. So personal data has not been disclosed, but looking at how they've dealt with Mars, I can see that they have prepared for this. China also has implemented a lot of technology, although this has not been disclosed. Seeing the structure of the state, they have prepared many things for outbreaks like this in times of crisis, and they've kind of used it in a very timely manner. So looking at it from hindsight, South Korea is utilizing technology very well, and they're protecting lives. So it is successful, but at the same time, in Japan, we have made efforts, of course, but our makeup of our state is different. And privacy, personal information, how far do we go as a state in terms of privacy? There are limits to that. So right now, as we have more people that are infected and our health system is put under a lot of pressure, as a researcher, we could not prepare for this. I'm kind of regretting that. So in South Korea, just Mars, you mentioned, there was a case already of tracing. So there's this social background already that this was something easy to implement. So from your perspective, as a researcher and doctor, are you kind of envious? No, I wouldn't say I'm envious, but when Mars happened, they were using GPS data. Sorry, I'm talking a little bit fast. So from the MERS outbreak, they were already using credit card transaction data as well as GPS data from mobile phones. So they were using those data from the MERS outbreak. So in that sense, they were preparing in a way for this. Citizens' detailed information, we will not use our authority to aggregate those things. We don't think that's ideal. So our question is, how do we protect the privacy of individuals, of citizens? How do we not touch that area? So that has been our efforts. So I'm not envious, but just looking at just the outcome, so the next couple weeks or the next half a year, there'll be a difference in the outcome. So there's a question of public health, protecting lives, having a strong straight power, and or protecting privacy, which is correct ethically. A pandemic will happen in the future again. So we need to prepare for that and think about how we can deal with that.
When I introduced this case from South Korea, using this credit card record and the data of CCTV and the mobile GPS. So all these different data are actually combined and it's used by the state to track. And it's instantly the information is shared with the citizens. Personally, I felt that it was rather, in a way, a violent thing to do. That was my first impression, at least. To say, for example, to a question to Okumura, to do something like this in Japan, where do you think the stop will actually happen?
So in a normal state and also an emergency state, it's different. So what we've considered up to now, using the budget of the state, is that in a normal state, we've prepared for a normal state. And we talked about, to how far we go with using personal information and protecting privacy. But in this emergency state, and when our health systems are strained and it will be overwhelmed, how do we protect lives is the question that we need to think about and discuss. So it's a little bit different in terms of the point of discussion is different.
Now a question to Michiko. Okumura just mentioned about the difference between the emergency state and the usual state. I think that also in the legal discussion, I think also you probably separate between different states of the emergency state and the usual state. What do you think? As you mentioned, to protect the people from crimes and to catch the criminals, something like GPS search is necessary, perhaps, and the procedures of, for example, getting the warrant is perhaps too much for the police authority to do their best to protect the people's lives. And that is a very one of the discussions that take place when we are working on this case. So it's not about taking one side or the other from me. Same thing with the coronavirus. Of course, it's important to prevent the virus from spreading, but it's also equally important to protect the privacy. So how to take the balance of this? With the GPS investigation, if it's necessary, it's something that may need to be done. And I think we as citizens might have to accept this. But to be able to accept, we have to also discuss about the rules, the regulations. So at least that's my thinking. So looking at how many different countries are responding to this virus using the big data to prevent, for example, the spread of the virus. And this discussion that because we are in this emergency state and our lives are put on stake, we must, people may think that we have to accept the violation of privacy. And some people may claim that the authority must have more power. And I think that's a very dangerous situation. Somehow I think we need to be calm and we always have to be aware about where we can find the balance. For example, in South Korea, people who are infected, their behavior, their location, there is tracked. And when they're quarantined, also monitoring their behaviors. I think they're using the big data to do this. But in Japan, we are, first of all, not doing enough testing. Because we are not doing testing, we don't even know how many people are infected. We don't really know the real situations of the infection. So when we have this issue, we cannot just discuss about the strengthening of surveillance and to say that that's the only way to stop the spread. I think that's actually really not balanced. So for example, there is a special measures law to respond to the novel influenza to declare the state of emergency. But when this declaration was made, and when you live in areas that are designated by this statement, it does actually touch on the rights of many people. It actually concerns the rights of many people. But many of the conditions for these controlling of the many of the conditions for something like this declaration has not been really discussed, and it's really abstract. And I think it gives a possibility for excessive controlling of human rights. But there is always this voice in the public that, but it's an emergency situation, and we cannot be thinking about privacy. So this issue of then how can we find a balance is, I think it's very critical.
So listening to Ms. Kameishi, Stephanie, what do you think? So this dilemma, this rather large dilemma, compared to other countries, we don't have a lot of people that are infected, but the scale of the dilemma is bigger in Europe, I believe. In Europe, I think the concern is that surveillance technology is necessary to a certain extent, but is it possible to have a democratic surveillance? That was the question. In Europe, Asia, the definition of the public is also different, you mentioned. In Europe, we have Google, Facebook is making a business out of personal data. And in Europe, there is a general data protection regulation that protects personal information.
Yeah, first I just want to agree about the question of if technology is always the right answer, which I think is what Michiko was saying. That it's tempting to rush to technology to solve the problem because it makes some jobs easier, and also because it's more public display of action. So, for example, testing seems harder to roll out in the end, which is not a new technology. so leaning on new technologies to do the work is a mistake, and I think I would absolutely agree with Michiko here. I think also in a country like Japan, where there are not as many cases, I mean, I believe you went into lockdown only the last few
Stephanie,
days.
if you could speak a little bit
but for us, we've
slower.
been in this situation.
Please speak a little bit slower. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm just slowing down for the translator. So I think in Japan, you've been in this situation only a few days for lockdown, if I'm right. But in Europe or in Germany here, we've been inside. This is my home here I'm speaking to you from for the last month. So things are quite different. I think that in the European context, there's a lot of loss of trust in technology in general. And not just because of the big companies you mentioned, but also because of the problems we've had with misinformation. And misinformation is responsible for a lot of confusion in this context. And I just wanted to say about data protection that this is the first really significant large-scale challenge we've had to the data protection laws in Europe. So that means, do they really work in times of crisis? They may work for companies, but can government, for example, overstretch these rules? And that's what we're testing now. I just want to go back. Sorry, I forgot to say when we were talking about the situation in Japan being earlier in the curve, is also that when you look at other countries that acted very quickly, like New Zealand, they had very strong leadership that made quick decisions, were very directive, being very clear with people what they had to do and why, and also very empathetic, understanding with people why it's so difficult. And this was a very effective and seems to be a very effective approach there. And as far as I'm aware, they're not using technology in this kind of scale. So I just wanted to agree with Michiko. Sometimes we need good leadership, good decision-making, good testing, all the things we already have before we reach for technology that changes the way we live. I have one more thing to say about the conversation we've had about GPS. So if I may, I just add that. Which is that we think about GPS technologies and we think about its disconnection from personal data. But what we know is that it's the behavioral data that matters. So the question of, where you go, how often, if you stay out late, who you see, these are the things that really matter about that data, not your name and, an image of your face or anything like that, but rather these other questions. And those things are the things that identify people. So it's very difficult to talk about anonymity in that context. I'm just mentioning it because I think it's this location technology is seen to be the thing that will solve all the problems, and as if there's some way to separate individuals from it, but there just isn't.
One question that I have is, when we prioritize privacy, personal information, the European stance that has also been contained, that's in contrast with China, who's containing the infection with technology. So could that kind of prioritization of privacy kind of, becoming a cause for the outbreak, further spread of the infection?
Well, first I'd say that we're not seeing that in Europe. They're not using technology, just to be clear. Even though the European perception is that we want to balance privacy and public needs, what we're seeing is technology is being used or is trying to be used. So for example, in Germany, the technology that's being developed right now that tries to recognize that location data is too exposes people too much is a Bluetooth-based technology that's the same as the technology being used in South Korea. So you have to be close to someone. It's a proximity technology, but it's the same as the South Korean technology. And the same goes for mobile phone data from the companies. Deutsche Telekom was the first to give data to the German government, well, sorry, to the main health research institute here. So by contrast, the UK, for example, was using drones in an early stage to try to get people to stay at home and stop them from walking in the countryside. So I just want to be clear, it's not that we're not seeing technology use, here we are. I think the debate might be bigger. That's maybe the difference. And then in China, we're also seeing not just the technology, but also the public the government reinforcement through hundreds of thousands of humans enforcing both the laws and also intelligence gathering. So I think in China, it's quite different from other countries, not just Europe, but most others, because of the double layer of not just technology, but also human enforcement, which we're not, as I'm aware, maybe I'm wrong, that we don't see yet in other places. I think in Europe, sorry, just say one last thing. In Europe, the real problem will come when we have to figure out how to move across countries again. It's the national interoperability and the cross borders, which will be very, very difficult when some countries have a dropping cases.
So I would like Mr. Okumura. Stephanie raised something very important, but protecting privacy while utilizing technology to control infectious diseases. So this kind of initiative is already happening in Europe, but convenience and individual freedom is kind of at odds with each other. So where do we draw the line? So that is the question that is being raised. One thing is that privacy being anonymous, data being anonymous, if that's the case, for citizens who are concerned, if data is anonymized, then maybe a lot of people are okay with their data, personal data being used. But as a doctor, I would like to ask, so if there are lots of citizens who are okay with using providing anonymized data, where do you draw the line? What will be the rules for that? So a lot of technology researchers, that's not part of our job. So I think this area needs to be spoken by someone specializing in legislation law. But I don't think the two are at odds with each other. So balance is very important. So that's something that's someone else raised. One thing, what you mentioned, Daisuke, using location data. How do we use that while not breaching privacy? Making sure that there is making it anonymous. If there's a technology like that, it would work. And that's what we've been working towards. So the privacy of citizens, protecting that while controlling infections. So that was our motivation in the first place. So there isn't discussion, but that's really our goal. So as researchers in public health, the question is, how do we protect privacy and at the same time protect citizens from infectious diseases? But things are moving very fast, and this outbreak, more than what we've anticipated. And it's just growing into an unprecedented scale, this coronavirus. Many things are unprecedented. And at the same time, our efforts we didn't prepare enough. We couldn't make it in time.
Another point raised by Stephanie, that to respond to the infectious disease, when the personal data is used to control, yes, I also think that we have to accept if it's necessary in the emergency state. But the question is, then can we go back once the outbreak has subsided? So this infectious disease doesn't just have one peak. It could have many peaks. It's even possible that the second outbreak would kill even more people. In Japan, may have second outbreak, third outbreak, and so on. So this is something that we have to face, that the whole global society has to face. And also the virus can change into different viruses. So different infectious disease can come out of this, for example, or we may face another disease. And then in the state, do we have even more power in the national authority? So this, when we say that we can allow the state to use these personal data just in the emergency state, that could actually numb the senses of the citizen.
So there's not a lot of arguments. We need to kind of evaluate the merits and demerits, advantages, disadvantages, and at the same time, how do we kind of win back our power? Stephanie mentioned this in the early part of the discussion, but how we surveillance state authority? Those things have not yet been. It's not about arguing, but more about discussing, and we need to find the right answer, and at the same time we need to find a system that follows standards, and of course it needs to prioritize citizens. Without that we can't have a discussion.
Now I would like to ask Michiko, as Okumura-san said, I think it's actually goes together with what you're saying about the necessity for making rules. When especially our human rights is being limited. So not only in the lockdown, but also in our state of emergency, there are many possibility of risking human rights in different ways. So we have to really discuss about making rules. Now, I think there are many sort of holes in the discussion in the legal system also. There's the SNS in Japan called LINE. And the Ministry of Health actually did the survey using this SNS application called LINE, asking the users about their health conditions. So actually the government, the Ministry of Health, asked the company to use their platform to do this survey, and there is no legal there's no legal basis for this. It's not legally binding. They didn't have to follow. It was just a request by the government. And about the discussion was that if it doesn't touch on the personal information in terms of that, if we can keep the anonymity of the information, then it doesn't touch on the privacy, personal information protection law of the Constitution. But actually, these data from even these anonymous data, if it's aggregated, you can actually you can identify the personal information very easily just by combining a few different sets of data. So that's the situation. And then does it really not does it not violate the personal information protection law? We have not even been able to validate this. We haven't been able to test this, discuss this. And this law, the information protection law, also has many issues on its own. It was revised in 2015, and there's no regulation for profiling. Means that in the process of profiling, if the analysis of the profile brings any negative effect on the person. For example, in the U.S., you have to make sure that you have to use the data not to, for example, subject the person to any racial discrimination, but the current Japanese law doesn't doesn't necessarily work on this area. Doesn't have any provision. And also, there's no obligation on the consumers. There is no system of helping the people who are affected by the usage of this personal data. For example, maybe someone is if a person is tricked by, it's like a second use of the data, and somehow a person is subjected to some sort of damage. The law doesn't protect these people. So as you can see, the current state of the personal information protection law has many issues. And maybe we cannot work on all these problems right now in the emergency state, but it's also very dangerous to just go with this law with all these problems.
Can I just add one thing? So there's things that can be validated just by looking at the facts. So if we can evaluate that, but my understanding is that the measures, the demographic data that is used is from companies that provides them as products. So it's already aggregated based on consent, and that is being used by authorities. So it is, my understanding is that these companies have provided this data. So the issue here is protecting privacy. So these data have all been anonymized. So if they've already been done that as data sets, anonymized data sets, I think that would not be a problem if you could just fact check that part. The Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, what I was surprised was it was aggregating search history. The minister, so GPS data, anonymized data. There was also talk about search history, and I thought, what was that? Basically, so you used these things used for crime investigations. So I thought search history was quite private, but Corona. So people that's searching Corona-related words, they would search for that, and they would track these kind of people. So that's what they were thinking. But when this came out in the news, the reaction towards this, like you pointed out, Mr. Okumura, in Japan, it relates to protecting privacy. So we can't necessarily utilize everything. That wasn't the intention. So I think at this point, the specialist committee, the governmental panel for infectious diseases, so they were using personal data to detect infected people at an early state. And so they were talking about the need for discussions around that. So it is kind of, in Japan, the intent is not to take extreme measures. They are kind of considering a discussion. So what I wanted to ask you, Stephanie, is the discussion that's being had here. So in an advanced technology, smartphones, in a day where lots of data is being aggregated. So what in terms of risk communication, how should we approach this? The Japanese people, our data is being already aggregated and it's being utilized. A lot of people aren't really bothered by that. I think we're not too concerned about privacy here in Japan, but in a time of crisis, utilizing this kind of data, this kind of risk communication. What are your thoughts on that, Stephanie? If you could talk a little bit slower, that'd be appreciated.
Can you just explain to me what you mean by risk communication? Do you mean how it's discussed between the government and technology companies and the people, or something else?
So when people become anxious in this outbreak, people are anxious, and in the situation, what types of actions should they not take? What kind of actions can they take? Where should they go? So informing people, so if they go to a certain place, what kind of data would be extracted? Or so let's say they test positive for the coronavirus, and maybe the whole neighborhood knows, or that's been disseminated on the internet. So there's lots of anxieties surrounding that. So people become very anxious thinking about these things. So what kind of information can we give to those people who are feeling these anxious feelings?
Okay, thanks for the explanation. Now I understand. Yeah, I was going to say actually that, of course, one of the largest questions here is around privacy. But even if we manage to solve the privacy question somehow, I don't know how, but if we solved it, then we'd have a different question, I think, which would be about how people are treated. So let's say we don't know who they are, but you might be treated differently based on whether you've had it or not, or you might be treated differently based on which age group you're in, or you might be treated differently based on where you are in terms of class. So, for example, are you a service provider or are you an office worker? And these will be the next questions if we solve the privacy of individual problem. And maybe this touches on what you're saying. And I think this is a question about the starting to see these issues of technology use in the immediate term. So right now we want technologies that work, that we haven't tested, that we haven't debated, that we don't have the laws for, that we were not ready to use in most cases. But we want it now because we think it saves lives. And maybe it does, we don't know. But that's different from the midterm, like when we want to start circulating again in society, like we want to go back to work, we need to send our children back to school, we want to travel again, that's totally different. And then that's different again, as you said, with this long-term challenge. We can anticipate, peaks, or we go back and in and out of this problem. We don't know a lot of answers right now about immunity. So, for example, if you've already had it, does that give you the passport to enter society again? And what does that create when we, if that's the case, we don't know. If that's the case, will people intentionally get it so they can enter society again? And so all these questions are, privacy is very important, but it's not the only question about data, I think. Because there's also the question of how that changes the way we treat each other in communities. In the future, we don't know, but how will it? And then the second thing is, who has that information? What kind of centralization of data do we have that we didn't have before? Which may be about equity and data control, not about privacy. It may create power, for example. Somebody may be able to sell it, or it may be used as power for political gain. So I think the difference will be like these very short-term concerns, which are maybe anxious for individuals, or create anxiety for individuals, compared to the societal challenges we'll have in terms of how we navigate the long game, what will happen next, and what technologies will we see when we then want better early warning systems, or we want to better control human touch. So, for example, not having to go into a store and touch digital money. Real money. We want digital money. All these things will change in the future. So the anxiety is definitely there for individuals now, but I think it will be an ongoing challenge. And I think the thing we can learn here is that we had the technology in place to respond, but we didn't have the legal or societal or cultural, ethical dilemmas resolved at all. And that's why we're doing it now.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, having this midterm and long-term vision, I think, is also very important. And I of course, I don't think we can reach a conclusion right now in this discussion. We would like to take another break now, about 5 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience members. So people who are watching, who have been watching, listening, if you can also write your questions and so on, that would be really great. And then we'll be answering them. We'll be responding to them when we open again, come back from the break. Okay. So we have been broadcasting on the over the internet, and we have some questions. So I would like to throw them to the panelists. Question to Mr. Okumura. If we do testing randomly, we should be able to find the infection, the state of the infection, and the routes of infection by statistics.
Thank you for the question. So the first question, theoretically, so the capacity for the tests, if we do random sampling, we could, to a certain extent, have an idea of how much the infection is spread theoretically, but we don't have a system that can make that possible. So just changing that system, that would be a great burden on the system, the authorities, those involved in the testing, and also the Department of Public Health is making their best effort. So it'd be great if the citizens could give us their trust for new technology, tracking technology. What we have researched is not only tracking, tracing, but implementing new technology. There's privacy. How much should we put on the line? How much effect would that have? How much can we decrease the number of infections and the number of deaths? Of course, in coming up with a policy, that's very important. Coming up with concrete numbers. As for myself, the question of whether that kind of research is happening, that is not being conducted right now. But of course, ideally, having those numbers in presenting those numbers to citizens and policymakers is necessary in creating a policy based on consent and discussion.
An additional question to Okumura. So public health, and so when you're working on the research on this many different technology in public health and also infectious disease, and I think many of these research was in a way simulation using numbers, but now we're facing with a real epidemic. Are there some things that are as you expected, and I'm sure there are also things that you didn't expect. So if you can share some of these.
Thank you for the question. What we had. So yes, as you said, there were things that we anticipated that actually became reality, and vice versa. So platformers, meaning businesses who have a lot of data, we knew that we would have their cooperation and support, and that actually happened. What was not anticipated was that contact tracing apps, so using a mobile app, having people download those apps, these types of technologies has come up. In a normal situation, we knew that those things were possible. So researchers anticipated that this would be feasible, but we didn't have a situation where everyone would be downloading these apps. So we did not anticipate that. So in Singapore, for example, these apps are being widely used, I hear. So tracing apps actually being implemented and producing an outcome was not something that we anticipated.
I see. Thank you. Another question now to Stephanie. Democratic surveillance may not be possible, and on the other hand, looking at Google's work, for example, the GPS information can be used used rather effectively to say that it's actually valid to help the public health. But on the other hand, GAFA, GAFA, Google. But how much can we trust these big tech companies is a question. So can you say a few things about this?
Yes, some of those big companies have proven to be more trustworthy than others the last few years. I think one of the things that has helped is some transparency. I think Google has tried to give some transparency and insights to users, and now you see with this Google mobility report that was shown as an example earlier, they have tried to share that data not only with governments, for example, but also with citizens. So I'm not suggesting that they're perfect or they've got it right, but I am saying that at least they're trying to use transparency as one tool, and it would be really important that the other companies do the same. In terms of trust, we have to remember that regardless of how much we rely on these companies, and regardless of how much they present themselves as solving social problems, they are companies that mainly, in the case of Facebook and Google at least, make their money from advertising. Nearly all their money, in fact, from advertising. So this obviously means that the question of trust is a very complicated one. These are not public companies. They're not working in the public good. They may have made a business out of selling themselves this way, but that is not what they do. I don't think there has yet been much research on the use of, for example, micro-targeting in advertising around coronavirus, but we may see that soon, and then the debate may get a little bit more complicated. So, for example, will they use the data they have, personal data they have on individuals, to micro-target them with advertising as they do with commercial products like travel or shoes or whatever? And just we've seen this technology used for elections, like in the US, for example, but also in Europe. And would this technology be used for health information, targeting certain individuals? We don't know. So these kinds of things may make these questions of trust in the companies more extreme. And also the question of how much money they make out of this kind of pandemic might become a very complicated question.
Understood. I would like to ask Michiko. So, given our police force and the government, utilizing this kind of very aggressive surveillance system, I don't think that our current authorities have an ability. I think they should do something that comes before that. So because having power can, they can abuse that power, but of course we need to regulate that through the laws. But besides regulating laws, what else should we be wary of?
What we feel anxious about is that there is no system to monitor the surveillance, monitor the monitoring. What the nation state does, what the police authority does, there is no third party who can monitor or do the surveillance of their surveillance. Until now, commercial corporations have information of using personal data for advertising and so on. We already knew that, but what does that mean when this information, which have been used by the commercially, is now handed to the nation state? What does it mean for us? So the information held by who is used by what, for what reason. It's really important for us to know, but it's also unclear how much we can actually know because it's quite massive. Even if someone wants to make sure that they don't release any data, they don't even know how to do that. So I think that would make many people feel rather worried, anxious. So as Stephanie also mentioned now, to secure the transparency, the corporations, the nation state, how they can win the trust of the people, and how for them to win the trust so that they can use the data they need. I think it would require time still in Japan.
So we are almost running out of time. So lastly, I have a question for all of our panelists. The last question is, it was a very interesting broadcast. Thank you very much. Tracking technology is not only about the technology itself, but it has lots of legal and social implications. And because in this time of crisis, we need to collect data in different means as much as we can. But 2-3 years into the future, what will happen? And so long term, thinking about things in the midterm, the long term, it was what Stephanie said, and Mr. Okumura has also said. It's not about difference in position. It's not all or nothing. It's not about liberty and surveillance, but where do we strike a balance? And how do we have that discussion, a careful discussion? We need to do it quick, but we need to do it precautiously. I think that's our consensus that we came to in this broadcast. So 2-3 years into the future, where do we aim for? So if you could just share your thoughts, maybe we can start with Stephanie.
I get the hard job first. Okay. So 2-3 years in the future, I think, I think we should not imagine that this is a one-time thing. I think we should assume, whether for this reason or because of other things we've already seen also this year. I mean, if we think about things like the forest fires in Australia, that was so devastating, information was also really important there, or many things that happened in the last few years. So we can assume that some kind of crisis response, whether it's health or anything else,
Stephanie, if you could slow down a little bit,
citizens
thank you.
Navigate the situation will be important. So I would say that the things we have to resolve, the legal issues, the cultural issues, the design ethics issues as well. This is not only about this moment, but there's some things that we're going to have to resolve over the next decade or so. So, and there are options on this balance. So, for example, how can we put laws in place that are necessary and proportionate, and think about things like the irreversibility of data collection? How can we have ethical practices in technology design that do things like make the technology transparent so people can trust it?
Can you repeat that, Stephanie?
Sorry, we're just having a second for the translation. I was saying that the legal issues, but also the ethical questions for design that are options. So, for example, what does it look like to design a technology from the beginning that keeps in mind this kind of use, and thinks about transparency from the beginning and has privacy built in, or questions around centralization built in from the beginning? And then the other thing I would say is, which I mentioned earlier, is the temptation that we're going to face around early warning systems, not just at the national level, but also at the personal level. What kind of individual technologies will be asked to wear when you think about things like, I don't know, fitness trackers or sensors in the home? in order to stop this kind of outbreak again. And so how we navigate that temptation to put technology on everything to protect us in the future will be probably the most difficult thing.
Sorry, this is unrelated to the theme of this broadcast today, but I just have another question, very short. In the past 5 years, Europe has faced immigrants, asylum seekers, and the solidarity between the relationship between European countries has changed. So we had Brexit, but with this corona shock, the relationship, the cooperation between different countries is being very important. At the same time, the countries are considering closing its borders or increasing its power. From your perspective, Stephanie, do you think this corona shock is striking the solidarity between the EU countries, or do you think it's kind of dividing the countries in the EU?
Both, unfortunately. I think it is dividing it's strengthening the nationalistic sentimentality, which is a problem, and it increases sovereignty. So the political change we've seen in the scene will be more so. People suspicious of people from other places, people wanting to keep their national borders more closed, people wanting independence in decision making. All these political things have made the trend we already saw, which was for some people very problematic, has become stronger, including more authoritarian or more strong-handed government. But why I said both is also between people on a human level, we see more solidarity. So, people singing songs and sharing them on the internet, or people sharing ways to, culturally keep their spirits up, or to show solidarity with showing support, like especially to Italy, for example, one of the first countries to suffer the most. So I think I would say, unfortunately, on the formal government level, we see the segregation of Europe and the increasing nationalism. But on a personal, human level, I think we see a lot of hope and a lot of empathy.
Thank you very much. Now a question to Michiko. Prospect in 2 to 3 years, what kind of discussion we have to have, or anything you want to mention at the last before we close. So 3 years ago, we worked on this case of the GPS investigation trial, and our defense was that we claimed that this trial really would show to the society which direction or we are going with the use of the information. And now we already have 3 years have passed, and I feel like the whole case, the discussion that happened around the case is now ignored when we are facing this situation. So when we're thinking about the future, what happens now from now on, the country that has the power, the authority to control people, once they gain this power, I don't think they'll let go of this power. We are in an emergency state, so in a way, especially because our lives are at stake, we may not be so calm. It may be difficult for us to be calm, but this very totalitarian controlling situation of the state, there are many things that we will lose, and we have to be aware of this. We have to think about this, looking at the situation of the China, and everything is actually monitored, controlled, over the internet, for example, in China. And so these many things can happen, and we have to be really aware of this. And so lastly, I'd like to also hear from Okumura.
Thank you for inviting me for this broadcast today. My message, if I put it into one sentence, so public health in Japan, how can we gain trust from our citizens is what I wanted to say. So location data, using that for public health and preventing infectious disease. So people are anxious that their private information will be used by authorities, I think. But what I can say is in Japanese public health, utilizing location data, evaluating the use, comes from a place of how to protect the privacy of those infected and citizens. How do we use new technology? So from that aspect, so that is our stance in those evaluations, considerations are happening. So our intention is not to surveil our citizens or abuse our power in a violent way and use that to control our citizens in any way. We are trying to use new technology to protect privacy and at the same time take control measures for infectious diseases. And so that's what we've been putting our efforts into, us researchers. So our motivation, our stance, our starting point is different from other countries. Thank you very much.
By the way, I think when you comparing to when you started the research, the situation now in Japan, since especially February, I think you must be really busy. I think the situation is changing so fast, so radically. In a way, like maybe, do you feel like your life has changed in a way?
In that sense, we are a research body under the Ministry of Health. So that's the format that we are running under. But the measures against the novel coronavirus is more. The central movement is happening in the cabinet office. So the tracking apps, the development of that, there's a distance to what our research, what we're doing. So our research efforts, we're hoping that it will be utilized in the policy of our government.
So it's so the research needs to be applied in a more instant, but also we need to. But the research also has a midterm and long-term visions.
So we'd like to give feedback that will be useful for this current situation, this outbreak.
Thank you so much, all the panelists. I know that you're very busy. I feel that we don't not necessarily approaching one conclusion, but really engaging in this discussion, debate from different perspectives. Yes, the technology is very convenient, and there's a lot of temptations. But if we are not careful, then many things will be risked. So we have to be careful about finding the balance, and especially thinking of technology that can be effective in controlling the infectious disease. The perspective is very important that are shared by Okumura's research, for example. Being able to. For example, his research being able to incorporate it into the policy, for example. So all these things I think are very important, and this sort of discussion, the place for this discussion is it's very difficult to find a place for discussion in emergency state, and in this critical condition, the panelists still could gather to do this discussions. I'm really grateful. And we'll leave the archive of this discussion so people can see also if they couldn't see it now live. So all the panelists and all the audience, thank you so much. And we'll have another discussion next week on a different topic. So the discussion will continue. Thank you, everyone.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you. Arigato.